All right, so I thought I'd make a video about psychiatry and priests. And basically, the driving thrust of my argument is never give to a psychiatrist what a priest can do, basically. Um, Priests are a much safer repository now that the secular authority of the church is broken. I know there's a lot of people that say the loony left should be locked up in loony bins and so on, but are you sure you want to empower the state to decide who's got zero grasp on reality or zero grip on reality, right? Because it's the state. Some examples of clear abuse of psychiatry. And by the way, this isn't me just saying like, oh, we shouldn't have any psychiatrists or any loony psychotic break having people safe areas where they can be confined for a little while in a calmer environment. But they should be relatively temporary, I would think, and then move to mental health housing, which is a little bit emphasizing no drugs or alcohol or something like that on premise. And my experience with the mental health housing is they didn't mind if you had a little bit of weed or marijuana, off the property. And they didn't mind if you went for like a single beer or maybe two beers, depending on the size of the glass, with like a burger at the local pub or something. So that was actually quite good. What they had a problem with was the hard drugs, or smoking too much weed, or getting absolutely pissed, drunk, wasted. So that's really good, what I found in my experiences of mental health housing. Now, I kind of did harder drugs. It was off the shelf, technically drugs, of a pharmacy, and like it was not over the counter even. It was off the shelf where anyone could get it, basically. But it was harder drug than marijuana, at least. So it is what it is. But anyways, I personally fell afoul of the no hard drugs policy myself, but it was in a process of I was really still addicted to cough syrup and so on. So it wasn't like it wasn't like where I am now, where I haven't done it for like 4.5 years or something like that. Or I did it like twice or three times over 4.5 years, and I haven't done it at all for 3.5 years. So like three times in a year. Which is it's basically like a little, you're doing it a lot, and then you kind of like tail it off, and eventually you just don't do anymore. And it's like, one of the things I mentioned before is that I had this problem. And I mentioned that the justice system basically told me I had a special court order not to do it at all, or else I'd go to jail. And basically what they did is they gave me light slaps on the wrist repeatedly every time I got caught, which I got caught basically every time. And they just gave me light slaps on the wrist and so on, because I wasn't hurting anyone else or anything like that. I was just hurting myself. And they kind of treated me gently, because I wasn't attacking other people particularly or anything like that. I was just having a hard time feeling guilty about my own misdeeds in the past. So they're like, okay, we'll slap you on the wrist, and like, we don't want you to do it, and we're going to make sure we don't want you to do it, but we're not going to like wreck your life entirely or something like that. And the repeated enforcement of light taps on the wrist for self-destructive but not destructive towards other people behavior type, helped me cut out cough syrup through, okay, I don't want to go to jail for a day or two or three, but it's okay if I drink a little beer, and it's okay if I smoke cigarettes. So I'm going to focus on doing those things and not getting too drunk, because I don't like to get drunk, but I like to do cough syrup. But a little buzz from beer, not even tipsy, um, and just relaxing and enjoying myself and so on. Doing what I'm allowed to do and having an outlet while still being moving away from the hard drugs. And really, my experience with the mental health system for a while was horrible, personally. Like, for most of my adult life, I've been doing cough syrup until a certain point in time. And I managed to keep it well within control, basically, until it became schizo. And then I started, like, thinking there were signs from God everywhere and so on. And it was very disappointing in me and so on. So I was like, oh no, what do I do? And so on. But at the same time, I was alone and lonely, and like I thought basically life was as good as it was ever going to get, and like, you know, I might be alone for the rest of my life, but at least I've got cough syrup to keep me going, and like that's kind of how I viewed it, and so on. And eventually, these signs from God or schizophrenia basically terrified me into doing self destructive things that made me lose my home and so on. So I got locked up in the psych ward for a while. And one of the things that they changed over COVID is they didn't allow you out once an hour for about 10-15 minutes if you were stable enough. They just blanket made it so you couldn't leave at all, even for a break or a walk around the hospital or a smoke or anything like that. And they told me they decided this was so good they'd keep doing it after COVID. And that really pissed me off. And that's what led to my lashing out and so on. Um, because it was like, it was hell. It was absolute hell. You know, it's like they felt self-righteous for locking people up and making them miserable, even though they wanted some time with fresh air and a little bit of interaction with normal people in the outside world and so on. And they locked you up worse than prison, where at least in prison you got an hour a day outside, basically. You know. Yeah. You know, I actually preferred homelessness to being in the psychiatrist ward. After that, basically. The first time I was in there for 3 months, and they let you out every hour for 10-15 minutes, and that was just fine, because I bought a computer, and they let me go for like 3 hours or 2 hours to buy the computer, and then I had the really slow internet on a really crappy computer that I'm using right now. But it was a cheap computer, and it was decent enough to run video games of some sorts, and you know, I just played within my limits and enjoyed life and so on, while waiting for some housing or something like that. Um, you know, so yeah, the psychiatrist system isn't necessarily that good, and it can lead easily to particularly abusive situations. One has to keep in mind that psychiatry is a secular, progressive domain of thought. It's a very utilitarian, sort of performative, we don't see you doing something kind of approach, but it's not like prison where it's like we see you doing something wrong, therefore we're punishing you. It's we're making your life hell for your own good because we're worried about you. And you're saying things that are different to other people, and that's scary to us. You know, it's kind of like a flowery language. Fascism, basically, is kind of the punk way of putting it, I guess. Um, um, and One more thing that's more of a better argument against psychiatry is that the Soviet Union, for those of you who are right wing, the Soviet Union particularly weaponized psychiatry to take out dissidents from society for like 30 years at a time. Because with psychiatry, when someone declares you mentally ill, they feel self-righteous for locking you away from society, even though you haven't done anything actually morally wrong. And that loophole gives massive, sweeping ability to abuse people that disagree with the narrative of the elites and so on. And of course, the state will not lock up in psychiatry institutions those who are its foot soldiers. The state will only particularly lock up those who stand against the state, for the most part. I mean, I get that there's a legitimate craziness that people have at times and so on, but sort of a sort of a better system, and my area of the world is doing it somewhat, but my objection was to the temporary but indefinite until they can find you housing situation of locking you away completely without any breaks from staying inside the loony bin at all when you're reasonably functional, just depressed basically, very depressed, but depressed. You know, locking you away inside for a month straight in the loony bin when you're just a depressed person with a little bit of schizophrenia, but not the full-blown thing necessarily, and your primary worries are based on reality to some extent and so on. You know, and you're reasonably calm and stuff like that, but you've got a few quirks and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And you were in there before and you didn't cause problems before and so on, but they lock you up anyways, worse than before. I forgot where I was going with that one. But it's traumatizing. What can I say? I preferred prison, I preferred homelessness over a psychiatrist, a psychiatric ward, personally. And the state may institutionalize temporarily people who are legitimately crazy who serve the state because they're just that obviously crazy. But they're more weaponized typically to institutionalize the people who are dissidents, who disagree with the official elite power center's narrative and so on, especially in corrupt societies and so on. And one of the things is the right wing and libertarianism, at least, when they say they're against the state, should acknowledge that in this particular case, the state can be very abusive very easily, very quickly, from even a good society beforehand 5 years ago. All it took was 2 years at most, or a year at most, before the state went absolutely bonkers in authoritarianism and so on. 1 or 2 years because of COVID. You know, like it's horrible. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't belong at all, but one should be very strict with the psychiatric ward and who gets in for what reason, and the limitations on the patients to some extent should be relaxed somewhat to maximize healing and so on. And part of that is basically, I mentioned at the beginning of my video, never give to a psychiatrist what a priest can do, right? Priests heal the soul when they're decent. Decent, not good even, not the best, decent. because they have the power of Jesus in them. A priest will tell you, yeah, something in you or something about your life is trying to destroy you. And we faced it too. We know about it. We understand you. We have felt this way ourselves. A priest deals with the fullness of the human condition, including its darkest moments, in a place that's designed to heal the soul, not just Pavlovian condition a person's behavior while they're suffering in hell on earth. And Pavlovian conditioning is basically just raw, like it's literally mechanical. It's basically, well, I'll give an example of Pavlov's dogs, basically. So you show a dog a steak, you put a steak in front of a dog, it drools. Eventually, you start ringing a bell whenever you put the steak in front of the dog drools again because of the steak and so on. You do this enough times, and when you ring the bell, the dog will drool. That's mechanical. But healing the soul is what a priest does, not a psychiatrist. At least in most cases, So there is some room for Pavlovian conditioning, mechanical response training, and so on. But the primary effort should be in healing the soul, so that the person can cope with their conditions and so on in a helpful and healing manner, to alleviate any potential abuse that someone who has control over whether or not you're locked up away for 30 years or not, even if you didn't do anything morally wrong, doesn't have that power, hopefully, because of the emphasis on the priest, not the psychiatrist. And that's the kind of society we want. So when you're talking about locking up the loony left and so on, be very careful how much power you give to the state, because the state might lock you up as well. And it's more likely to lock you up for being a dissident against the state than to lock up its own foot soldiers who are legitimately crazy. Because the state is a corrupt and terrible institution for the most part. Now, some people might say, oh, that's kind of Lolbertarian talk, but actually the right-wing reactionaries have a slightly different emphasis. The libertarian says, let my people go just for freedom's sake, and the right wing says, let my people go so they can worship their God. And there's a principle of virtue and honesty and justice and ethics and morality and so on, and a drive towards positive that the right-wing reactionaries have, while still disliking the state heavily in terms of communal bonding and an emphasis on it and an actual desire to see it come to fruition, communal bonding, whereas the libertarian just wants to have everything his way and no one to interfere. It's a slightly different emphasis. Well, actually, no, it's a night and day difference of an emphasis. But the first step of dismantling parts of the state and reducing its power is the same, but they take a wildly different path afterwards. So it's not libertarian for me to say I don't want the state to have that much control over people's well-being or not. I want the priests to have more say, not control, but say on people's souls and so on, or at least influence. And it doesn't mean that the priest necessarily converts them to Christianity or something like that, although that is part of the effort and so on. And I agree with that effort to some extent personally, because what I found is Christianity has taken whatever is going on with me, whether it's signs from God or schizophrenia or both, I don't know, and turned it into something that I can be stable, happy at times, even though I'm mental possibly, and healthy for the sake of other people at least a little bit. Helpful to other people at least a little bit. So and caring and compassionate for the suffering and the poor and so on. Which I complain about me slapping a band-aid on a gaping chest wound in my society at the moment. But if we had more people actually taking it seriously, then we would actually be doing things. And one exception I do have for this is particular to fentanyl and methamphetamine users. Those people need to be locked up and away from the drugs as much as possible for a good 3 months at least, I bet, in order to cure their addiction or not cure their addiction, but get them off the initial stages of withdrawals and the kickback and the obsession with drugs and so on, and the physical cravings for the most part. Not entirely, but for the most part. Those are the two exceptions. Fentanyl users and methamphetamine users are the two exceptions to this principle that I have, basically. Now, for people who are schizophrenic or have other mental conditions like dissociative identity disorder, otherwise known as multiple personality disorder, and so on, I think mental health housing is important because what happens with mental health housing is it's sort of like there's a caretaker team that checks on you every day, or you check in with them at the front desk every day and so on and talk a little bit. So there's a little bit of that human to human interaction, how's your day going and so on. That's not quite so intrusive, but they're also there in case something serious happens and they need to take care of you and so on. But you also have a critical aspect, which is you can actually go outside and into the community, and you can go and buy stuff at the store, spend time at the park, or go for a walk around the block, or something like that. And like just that is like, like even if you don't do anything much more, some degree of neighborliness with fellow people who are suffering mentally, the caretaker team to check in with every day so you can talk to someone about your situation and day-to-day experiences and your feelings and so on, and that freedom to go outside and enter the community and so on. It's just a little bit of extra support, and it's stable housing, and they kind of enforce through soft or gentle means for the most part, but a slight punishment of like 1 to 2 weeks or something every time you're caught doing hard drugs or something like that in the psych ward. But you can come. But my goal is that you can come back from the psych ward after 1 or 2 weeks as punishment or cleansing from doing hard drugs one time that they catch you. Is that your housing is stable, and you have a community of people who understand that you're going through a rough time because they're going through it too. And basically, one of the things that I found with the building I'm in right now is that there's a lot of camaraderie and companionship in the building I'm in right now because we're all going through similar things in terms of poverty and so on. So, and this is a reasonably free building. There's alcohol usage is greater than average for a lot of us and so on. I'm only drinking every 2 to 3 weeks with a 6-pack every 2 to 3 weeks myself. But, it's good to have company that understands your situation. What can I say? And to be free to go outside and walk around the block and go to stores and stuff like that on your own, or get some beer or get some cigarettes, or, I'm not smoking any marijuana. I'm not doing any hard drugs. I'm just doing nicotine, coffee, and occasional beers. Just that extra freedom and so on with the camaraderie, companionship, and a little bit of common sense and being free from drugs has done me a world of good that the psychiatric system could not do on its own. It took understanding Jesus Christ a little better to get to that point, and the companionship of my building. I'm lucky to be here basically because of the people I can contact and talk with and relate to and stuff like that, and they relate to me, and we have share life advice and life experiences and so on. That companionship and freedom, while still having a desire, personally at least, to avoid hard drugs, has done more for me than the intensive psychiatric care stuff basically ever could have. And it was literally me listening to priests and ministers and preachers and pastors and so on YouTube that mostly convinced me to calm down, as well as some associates and friends and stuff like that online and in the building and so on, that have calmed me down, not the psychiatric system. So never give to a psychiatrist what a priest can do, basically. I'm not a libertarian, I'm a reactionary liberal. Again, it's not let my people go so they can booze up and get totally wasted and get high as a kite and so on. It's let my people go so they can worship their God in peace. And that God is Jesus Christ for me.